everybody. My name is James Corsi, Executive Director of the Global Spaceport Alliance, and welcome to our webinar series. In keeping with our title of being global, today we're going to be featuring a look at the UK space clusters with a really exciting panel to reflect on everything that's going on over there. Before we get started, I'd like to just take a moment to update you on a few things. First, I'd like to thank our sponsors, RSNH, BRPH, and American Company. We also, since our last webinar, have a new member of Fiore Engineering, and they are a regional construction company. So welcome, Fiore. In aggregate, we're now up to 74 members. For those of you who are at the summit, we just hit 70 in January, so we're on track for this year to be over 85. We're also doing a fair amount of activity with a number of different organizations. As you know, in one of our discussions, I indicated that we're partnering with Farnborough International, and we'll be hosting a panel there on Tuesday, the 23rd of July. So if you can make it to Farnborough, please make a point of joining us. We're also partnering with the Office of Spaceports of FAA, and they're putting on a workshop panel prior to IAC in Milan on October 13th. It's never too early to get in your calendar the Spaceport Summit that's going to take place on January 27. It's also going to continue in Orlando. The details of that can be found and are available at our website. Now, as you know, the Spaceport Summit kicks off Commercial Space Week, which is in addition to SpaceCom and Space Mobility. And just as a flag for everybody, SpaceCom in particular is accepting presentation proposals, but there is a deadline of July 10th. So if you want to submit a proposal, you have to get it in quickly. If you need any additional information on becoming a member, you can go to our website, globalspaceportalliance.com. But we encourage you to become a member of what we now know is the largest spaceport network in the world. Member benefits are listed there, but probably the most significant of all is the ability to network with other spaceports and their suppliers worldwide. We also want to make sure that you register for the GSA newsletter. Again, it's available on our website. As part of our initiative, we've established 7 advisory groups, and we're encouraging members to join these groups. If you see one of these subject matters that is of particular interest to you, please reach out to Steve or George or myself, and we will make sure that you get organized to join one of those groups. Last week, we had an opportunity to go to the Hill and really have a very interesting discussion and presentation around the growing importance of spaceports to the world economy. And George was able to lead that delegation. And I'm going to turn it over to him now to give a brief description of what happened last week, and then also to host the remaining part of the seminar. So George, over to you.
Thank you, James. That special event at Capitol Hill last week was really interesting. It was focused on the growing importance of spaceports to the world economy. And we had representatives from 4 very successful spaceports that were on our panel there. It included Rob Long, who's the CEO of Space Florida, retired Major General Ted Mercer, who's the CEO and Executive Director of the Virginia Spaceport Authority. We had Scott McLaughlin, the Executive Director of New Mexico Spaceport Authority at Spaceport America, and Arturo Machuca, who's the Director of the Houston Spaceport. And we talked a little bit about all of the exciting things happening in the commercial space arena worldwide, increase the number of launches and human space flights, the growth of the global space economy, and many other items. And then we talked a little bit about some of the areas where we feel that Congress could really help out in terms of support for spaceports and continuing the growth in the global space economy. We identified some of the provisions for some proposed legislation that we have developed, and they included the establishment of a commercial space transportation administration, where we actually recommend moving the Office of Commercial Space Transportation out from under the FAA and having it report directly to the Secretary of Transportation at DOT. We talked about the creation of a commercial spaceflight research alliance that would be inclusive and international in scope and very collaborative, working on some of the issues that are particularly important to commercial space as opposed to what the Department of Defense and NASA do in their respective sectors. We mentioned the benefits of adopting a national spaceport policy that supports the development of a network of spaceports, including those that are owned and operated by the government and commercial spaceports and privately owned and operated launch and landing sites. And we believe that is a major step towards increasing not only the continued growth of the global space economy, but also ensuring access to space for all users. We mentioned the importance of spaceport infrastructure funding, whether that's from government grants or private sources, given how important infrastructure is to all modes of transportation. We also talked about how human spaceflight training could be improved by allowing people to buy tickets to fly in the back seats of high performance or former military aircraft. That's something that has been done in the past, and NASA continues to use that as an approach to train its astronauts, and we'd like to see the policies change to allow that to be done commercially in the United States. And then finally, we talked about one of my favorite topics, point-to-point transportation, that I think is just right around the corner, and all the potential benefits that that has to our international spaceport community. So those are some of the key provisions that we talked about in our session. More information is available on our website. With that, let's turn to the topic of today, which is creating spaceport clusters. We've got an outstanding panel to discuss that today, including we have Francis Walker, Associate Principal from Corgan's office in London. We have Gemma Wilson, the Development Manager for the Harwell Space Cluster. Daniel Smith, the Director of AstroAgency, Fire Aero and Space Scotland. Ross Hulbert is Head of Engagement for Cornwall Spaceport. And Dr. David Alexander, who's the Director of Rice Space Institute. So a lot of different perspectives, all focused on creating spaceport clusters with particular emphasis on the United Kingdom. So why don't we start off with Francis Walker. I've had several engagements with Francis over the years and have really been impressed with his creativity. And even in terms of the bio that Corgan uses in describing him, they point out that whether we're talking about painting contemporary works of art or strumming solos on his collection of acoustic guitars, he fuels his creativity in imaginative ways. He's Scottish born and raised, and Francis attended the Glasgow School of Art. And now, as the Director of Aviation Studio in London, he heads the development of the international market with a broad focus on business development, strategic planning, design, and project delivery. He's a strong advocate for sustainable design. He believes that sustainability should be embedded in the design process, with architecture serving to challenge and inspire. So with that, over to you, Francis.
Thank you, George. I'm humbled by your kind words. Okay, great. So yeah, thanks for that great intro. I'll try and live up to the hype. Today, what I'm going to talk about just in a few slides is something that we've been working on in the studio here, and in the context of space clusters, or indeed space networks. And we're going to zoom in on the area around the Irish Sea. But just as a little bit of a recap, previously what we've shared on this platform and others is the idea of the potential of spaceports as new typologies, or as new types of communities, where we seek to leverage the sort of boundless possibilities of space and the space sector to sort of redefine design, research, creativity, manufacturing, industry, try and bring those things into an integrated environment with the purpose of finding cross-pollination, because that's usually where the unique and innovative and groundbreaking ideas is, where you take opposites and you put them together. And it also sort of follows a sustainability agenda of increased concentration of places where things happen, of having less silos between communities and different areas of expertise, and providing a forum or a backdrop focused on space, but with this exciting new typology to express it. So we've been working on that, and really the point is it's limitless, the applications of this. Everything we need on Earth, we need on space with a bag of chips, as they say. It becomes more critical and there's more of them, and this is an exciting aspect of the possibility of this typology. So today, in terms of the space clusters, what we did was we took a different view. We put a different lens on the idea of the UK and Ireland being these islands that are separated from each other, separated from the northeast coast of Europe. And I think that what's interesting there is that rather than see the water as something which divides, the water becomes something which connects, and that starts to create a lot of interesting ideas. So we chose the area around the Irish Sea selfishly because I'm from the west coast of Scotland and I grew up just up the road from Prestwick, where the spaceport's under development there. But I know that this is a model that could apply further down the coast past Bristol. Cornwall's obvious, the north coast of Europe. So these clusters that are connected by water is something that can be expanded and extended to any location that has a coastline, right? But one of the things, by zooming in, we get to study in a little bit more detail what the strengths and the weaknesses and challenges and opportunities are of a particular network or space cluster. And in this case with the Irish Sea, it's really interesting, these northern cities that have this industrial background. They have ports, they're still working ports, but we definitely see the possibility of regeneration and of bringing a second life to the ports and being a big employer if we add the aspect of space industry, space exploration and spaceports to these existing places. And what really becomes interesting in this specific diagram is sort of the Isle of Man at the central node. We know they've got the Space Isles, they've got a space program there. So there's a lot of seeds already there. This isn't something that's kind of coming out of nowhere. You've got Prestwick, you've got Isle of Man, Irish have a space program. And this was the area that we focused in on. But as I said earlier, you know, this can apply to any coastal location. I think the south coast of England and the north coast of Europe is a really interesting area that we're looking at as well. Creates more of a zigzag than a circle, but it's, you know, that's okay. And as I was saying earlier on, these ports, I think, have headroom as being somewhere that we could start to really look at a spaceport network coming out of that, with the Isle of Man at the heart of that. It's already starting to happen, and all we're saying is maybe there's a way to create a network, to create communication, to create a collected dialogue which is greater than the sum of its parts. And of course, with the sea, there are a lot of emerging transport technologies. Some are concepts, some are very close to market. Electric gliders, solar-powered cargo craft, sea drones, and what you do here is you have great headroom by using the sea as a connector, because you're not adding congestion to the roadways, and that's an issue in the UK and Ireland, as we have congested surface access and road network system. So we take that off the page, we sort of deconflict it from other modes of transport, and we also sort of de-risk as well, because you're flying over sea, you're not flying over populated areas. So a lot of potential there as well. Energy at source, there is abundant wind energy, there is existing nuclear, and there is fusion in development. So energy generation that would fuel the space industry is there and ready and available. These spaceports are going to be energy hungry, and we have abundant wind power. We also have nuclear program, and we have fusion in development, and there will be other energy sources available to us as these young people that we talk about come up with new and fantastic ideas for energy generation. So it's a really interesting part of the UK. It's a really interesting part of the world. It's not the only part, but it's useful for us to zoom in and start looking at the metrics and looking at the data and looking at the inspiration behind what these can be. And that was it.
Thanks for your perspectives on that. And then at this point, why don't we move to Gemma Wilson? Her current role is the Harwell Space Cluster Manager, where she connects organizations on the campus with new opportunities to support business growth, including access to the world-leading national test and evaluations facilities that are part of the Science and Technology Facilities Council. Gemma's role involves advocating the capabilities, facilities, and expertise across the whole of the UK space sector to government and international delegations. Her previous role was Regional Growth Manager at the Satellite Applications Catapult, where she ran the regional program, including the Catapult's Centers of Excellence. She has strong experience with subject matter experts, having also worked at a startup, and has managed the European Space Agency's Business Incubation Center, supporting new and innovative companies with their journey in the space sector. Gemma, welcome.
So first of all, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really delighted to be here on this panel. Some people I've met, some people I haven't. So I look forward to kind of continuing conversations, I think, and seeing what opportunities come out of this. I work for the Science and Technology Facilities Council, which is one of the research councils in the UK, under UK Research and Innovation. And I'm here today in my role as the Space Cluster Manager to tell you a little bit about Harwell and how we kind of connect up and work with colleagues on this call and others across the globe. We are based in Oxfordshire, where people that know the area, we're quite inland, so we don't have a spaceport. It would be a bit worrying if we did, I think. We are working as part of that supply chain and working with the fantastic activities that's happening. So picture there, picture behind me. I always like to be floating above Harwell at all times. And so the space cluster at Harwell, so I'll give you a bit of background, and this slide I'll just show briefly, because classic case with any slides that has logos on, the minute you do it, there's always a change. There's always something happening. But we have 100 space sector organisations on the campus, employing around 1,600 people. The thing to note about Harwell, the campus is a science and innovation campus. It was originally where the Royal Air Force was during World War II, and then it became the kind of place where the British nuclear programme was set up. So that's our kind of heritage there. And so it's always had this kind of real strong science piece, and the facilities from the Science and Technology Council, the Rutherford Appleton Lab, has been on the campus for many years. And one of our core departments is RAL Space. So RAL Space has been around for 60 years, has a heritage of around over 200 missions in space, really working on different missions, different activities. And then off the back of that, we were really privileged. The European Space Agency wanted to base in the UK and chose the campus because of that. And so we were excited to have the ESA EXSAT, so that's the European Centre for Satellite Applications and Telecommunications. I always feel with space things, we need a glossary kind of running down, don't we, when we just say all these acronyms. So apologies if I just say them without explaining. Alongside that, we actually then took on the mantle of running the European Space Agency's Business Incubation Centre. Of course, that incubation programme has been running for 15 years, where we take early startups, SMEs, using space technology and sort of helping them grow. There's ESA BICs around the UK now. The HQ is at Harwell, and that's really exciting for us. That kind of leads to the fact that we have such a range of companies, so we don't have sort of any that focus on a sort of specific area. There is this real mix. After the sort of ESA and ESA BIC, the Satellite Applications Catapult set up, which is another organisation that helps sort of bring a national organisation that helps bring industry and academia together to really kind of explore new technologies, energise the market. And these are all key kind of stakeholders for us. The UK Space Agency has always had a presence on the campus as well, but we were really proud this last month that they sort of opened their HQ on the site as well. So there's this real nice mix on this 700-acre site where you can kind of bump into kind of lots of different people and really help kind of unlock those opportunities. And I guess that's kind of my role to help navigate some of those for the companies that are here. The campus is actually managed as a joint venture between the public sector and the private. We partner with a private group called Brookfield Asset Management. And what that means is that we have a really great strategy where we can develop buildings and facilities so companies can grow. So we've got some fantastic examples of companies like Oxford Space Systems, like Astroscale, like Open Cosmos, MagDrive, there's lots to name, that have sort of started off small and could rent a desk or an office, but then been able to kind of move on into bigger buildings. What also is exciting about the campus is that we are multidisciplinary, and as I always say, other clusters are available at Harwell, not just space. So we have clusters in energy, health, tech and life sciences, and quantum. And actually, you know, space is such an enabler, and the really great thing about it is that there is this opportunity to link into other sectors and kind of learn from them and kind of see how space can play a role in that. And of course, that's sort of, you know, that's really great to have this kind of key areas on the campus that we can work with. Because we are a campus based, we of course don't just work in that boundary. We don't sort of step outside and we can't speak to anyone. We're very much about representing the UK space sector. We're fortunate we get a lot of visits, international delegations. And so what that means is that we can really kind of talk about what we have to offer on the campus about accessing those fantastic facilities, but also help direct where to go. So in the UK, we've actually got 15 space clusters. 2 are kind of represented here. So I thought I'd show you, because it's always about the power of people, this lovely map of all the different shiny, happy people that are working across the UK. And this group actually meets on a monthly basis. And I think that's really unique for many sectors, actually. And what we will do is kind of talk about what we need to help our community support. So we want to grow the kind of local economies, but we want to work nationally. And of course, underpinning all that is working internationally, because it's been said lots of times before that space is a team sport. And we you know, the team is international, it is global, and we need to work across that piece. That was kind of my point, but I just wanted to kind of add one other thing. It was great to hear Francis talk about the creativity side, because I'm a big believer in kind of innovation comes from kind of that diversity of thought and thinking. And there's lots of people that I've found out recently who are in the space sector that are actually really true creative people. So in the jobs they do and outside, and I think that really lends itself. I think it was International Creativity Day last month, which was good to learn. And I picked up some of the companies I'm working with are now kind of part of the space sector, but their previous roles were in textiles, in you know, Formula One racing, and kind of we've even got somebody who was a kite maker. You know, there's all these different things that can kind of like blend together and work collaboratively on that front. So that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gemma. All right, next up we have Daniel Smith. He is the founding director of 5 space companies since 2017. He's a 3-time Sir Arthur Clarke Award finalist for services to the UK space sector. Been Great British Entrepreneur of the Year Award finalist and listed among the top 40 people in aerospace to follow on LinkedIn. Been a national newspaper columnist. He has a passion for showcasing the benefits of commercial space to life on Earth. He's also been a space commentator on CNN and BBC. Been at the UN World Space Forum in Vienna, the Dubai Expo, London Science Museum, Korea Space Forum, Portuguese Space Agency, Atlantic Space Summit, and the UK Space Agency Ignite Space. So lots of different opportunities to engage. Share with us some of your thoughts, please. Daniel?
Thank you, and thanks to everybody for inviting me here today. I wasn't sure which hat to wear today. As you mentioned, I've been involved in quite a lot of different space companies, 3 that I represent at the moment. And I had a good chat with Izzy, who of course is on the call today, and we decided, well, why don't I draw on some experience from the 3, relevant experience from the 3 I work with at the moment. What I'll do though is I'll start with a bit of a nod to one of my fellow panelists today, to Ross actually, because when I was asked to do this webinar today and join everybody, it got me thinking about that relationship between spaceports and cluster activity, wider activity. So this is a bit of a blast from the past, but this is around 2018 when I worked for a launch company called Skyrora, and we did our engine testing down in Cornwall, which is basically the opposite end of the United Kingdom. And it always confused people because, you know, that was a vertical launch company that I worked for, and people were confused. Why are you going down to Cornwall? That's horizontal. But it's because we were leveraging some of the facilities there, as you can see on the screen, to test the engines. We got schools involved. It was a really great initiative and a lot of good PR as well to talk about the sector. And I think that was the first time I ever thought about the role of a spaceport as being the kind of it can be the central part of a much bigger story. And I'm sure we'll hear more from Ross. I'm not going to steal his thunder. So I'll quickly move on and talk a little bit now about the organisations that I'm part of. So AstroAgency, what we do is we want to try and change the perception of space and to get people to think more about the benefits of space activity for life on Earth. Because most of the work that I do in the space sector isn't actually about space at all. It's about Earth. So we started in 2019, shortly after that photograph we just looked at, and Cornwall were indeed one of the first companies, organisations we worked with. We've gone on to work with 65 different space companies around the world, also 8 different government agencies. So that includes space agencies like the UK Space Agency, who are one of our biggest clients, but also space agencies in different parts of the globe. And although we are focused on marketing, so that's everything from, you know, PR and websites and social media and shouting about the benefits of space to humanity, what we've ended up doing, because of the kind of unique position we're in, working across so many different companies, is that we've ended up helping a lot of the clusters in the UK to understand what's going on in their local area around space. So a little bit of mapping the capabilities and understanding the gaps. As in the previous slide, our head office is in Edinburgh. We do have a presence in Harwell and in Nipro, and we're looking to open an office later this year, and most likely in Asia. Watch this space. But a lot of this work we've done has been around supporting with research. So it's not so much kind of reports on, you know, the kind of work that Euroconsult and Novaspace, or one of our clients, do. We don't do that kind of projection. It's more around helping these local clusters where we literally have a footprint in and live in, to really understand what's going on and how they can grow their cluster. So being in Scotland, we worked on the plan for space in Scotland at first, which was funded by the UK Space Agency, to look at how we could increase the level of maturity of the cluster in Scotland. And one of the recommendations there was to create a Scottish space strategy. And the other one was to set up Space Scotland as a formalised entity and not for profit. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. We also wrote the world's first space sustainability roadmap, a strategy very much focused on work packages and output-led document to look at how we could be a more sustainable sector, something that Francis touched on earlier. It's very big passion for me as well. And we've worked with other clusters too. Space East, for example, we helped them with their strategy, which was a real honour. And we've got one coming soon. It's blurred out here. It's actually South of Scotland Enterprise. So David Alexander's there right now, but at any moment, it could be today or tomorrow, that will be launched, a strategy we did for them. And then the final one there is a Catapult one. So that's an organisation in the UK that we supported through UK Space Agency funding and with our partners No Space, to promote all of the space clusters in the UK internationally. So really championing what they do, what their capabilities are in the different clusters internationally, to bring in investment. So those are the kind of, you know, projects we've been involved in on the AstroAgency side. On the Fire Arrow side, essentially, because there's 7 different developing spaceports across the UK, the Fire Arrow team have been involved in a number of those, and we've worked with different companies that have been involved in many of those. And what we decided last year was to set up a new company that would use that experience of setting up small launch sites like we have in the UK, and basically exporting that to help other countries around the world that were looking to develop access to space and launch sites. And one of the really interesting things on the Fire Arrow side, and you know, we're speaking with the Middle East, we're speaking in Asia. We've got my colleague Stuart is actually in Kenya right now, speaking at the Kenyan Space Agency Expo. But a lot of the questions we get from potential customers on that side is, what is the potential for a launch site to become more and to actually build itself out into a cluster? And so it's just interesting to see the people around the world thinking of that, and clearly seeing some examples to learn from. Just onto Space Scotland then. So that's a not-for-profit that I'm involved in, and as the name suggests, it very much represents the Scottish cluster. But there are 180 odd companies in Scotland. We have 5 actually developing spaceports. And the interesting thing with Scotland is we actually build more small satellites than anywhere in Europe. I think it's actually anywhere outside of the US, which is something that not many people are aware of. But we also have a thriving downstream Earth observation ecosystem too. And that launch angle is really the missing piece of the jigsaw, the linchpin that can pull it all together. And we have great experience in deep space missions. The James Webb, we built the MIRI instrument in Edinburgh as well. And I've got a photo there of Spire, a company we work closely with. I built over 175 small satellites in Scotland. A great picture from my friend Max Alexander there. And the cluster itself is referred to as the Scottish Space Cluster a lot, but really we're a country. We're not so much a cluster. We're kind of a meta cluster, a cluster of clusters, because there's a number of different clusters, some that are building around the spaceports themselves, the 5 developing spaceports. That makes Scotland a little bit unique in that sense. And Space Scotland tries to bring together academia, government, and all the industry in Scotland to really resolve any problems and work together on the opportunities that such a new sector as it is in the UK, commercial sector anyway, presents. We've heard a little bit from Francis on Prestwick, and I'll come to that in a second, but just on the top line there, we have Sutherland. So Sutherland is a spaceport in the north of Scotland that is being run by Orbex, a small launch company. And we can already see, I'll actually be up there tomorrow morning, you can already see a cluster building around that North Coast cluster. And actually, Highlands and Islands Enterprise and Orbex are both members of the Global Spaceport Alliance too, which is great. So a bit of a shout out to them. On the bottom line, you'll see Saxa Board, which is Shetland. As you can see from the photograph, it's really developing fast there, and we do hope to see the first vertical launch into orbit from anywhere in Europe happening from Shetland later this year. And the interesting thing with that spaceport is it's really leveraging the cluster, the oil and gas cluster that they have up there, to try and give it strengths, the roads, the hotels, and to try and, leverage those to build its own cluster. And they have the likes of Skyrora and RFA and High Impulse looking to launch from there as well. But I'll focus on Prestwick for a moment because it's horizontal like Cornwall, and it's a spaceport that at AstroAgency we supported for a couple of years around the messaging. And when we were looking at that, the spaceport development itself, we came up with this concept of beyond launch as a tagline, because we wanted to not for people just to see the spaceport as a place to launch from, but to see it again as that focal point of a much larger economic opportunity and cluster development. So beyond launch is a tagline we came up with that always felt really succinctly put this opportunity that we're exploring on today's call. And again, Prestwick, they're right next to Scotland's largest aerospace cluster, very much using Houston, and we've got David Alexander, of course, on the call as a blueprint to build out that cluster. And I've included a small press release there too around 2 of the organisations that we support at AstroAgency, Astraeus, who signed up with Spirit Aerosystems. So 2 organisations within the cluster working together, something that Gemma has hinted to earlier, and she must see a lot of that happening in Harwell with all the different organisations. But when you have that cross-pollination, that working together within a cluster, as well as the cooperation with other clusters, it's really a great thing. So I'll just finish up here just by, I guess, making a few observations ahead of the conversation today around the benefits, I think, particularly for rural areas, of combining spaceports with clusters. Obviously, it brings that access to local supply chain, access to talent as well, the people that you might need to work in the spaceport, and indeed the ability to inspire schools, universities, and others. And I'm sure Ross will touch on that today as well, because it's something that Cornwall have been so good at. And I think, being a marketing guy, I'm going to mention this, right? But the importance of promotion and promoting the benefits to the people around the cluster, to pull in these other sectors that Gemma mentioned earlier, to try and get other industries, whether it's transport and logistics or whether it's IT or whatever it may be, to try and bring them in to support sectoral development, which is so important in the UK because we are a young developing commercial sector. So we need all the support we can get, and space is very much open to anybody with an interest in it. And of course, the public too, you want to get that buy-in. So promoting the benefits of clusters and spaceports will just support with that. And again, I'll touch back on sustainability here. So obviously, something we do in the Fire Arrow side is to help spaceport developments understand the commercial viability of what they're looking to do. But in my opinion, you can't have that economic sustainability without the environmental sustainability. We're in quite a unique position in the UK because we're building a lot of this launch infrastructure and launch sites from the ground up, now, and it's not been done before. We're able to build sustainability in early. It's a great opportunity. And it's something that I see across the whole of the UK, and the UK Space Agency are very much behind. So I think, as much as probably the biggest challenge we have in the space sector is the orbital debris problem, and that, in my opinion, I think that as people involved in spaceports, everybody involved in spaceports on this call, we should think about how can we support, spaceflight to be more environmentally conscious and drive down that impact, that negative impact, because every launch that happens, it starts from a launch site. So the supply chain, so, thinking about the materials that are used, the eco-fuels, and the way you build your spaceport, we need to think about that in an environmental way for the future. But I'll leave it at that, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion today.
Excellent. Thank you, Daniel. Next up, we have Ross Hulbert. Ross has a background in publishing, sales, marketing, international business development and trade and investment. He's currently serving as the head of engagement for Spaceport Cornwall. I think it's been a goal for Spaceport Cornwall to open space up for everyone, to be a hub for innovation and to inspire the kind of change which makes a more sustainable approach to space a reality. This connectivity is crucial between air and spaceports, between research and business, between people and ideas. A fully joined up and unified operation which shares resources, facilities, and expertise will bring about efficiencies which will allow a sustainable, commercially viable, high-tech sector to thrive. So welcome, Ross.
Okay, yeah, thanks for the intro. And Daniel, always good to see you. I'm sure your job description gets longer every time I meet you. But yeah, obviously back in the day when you came down to Skyrora to test the Alpha Stage engine, I mean, what was that, 2019 maybe? And this provided a great opportunity for us to collaborate. As you say, couldn't be further apart geographically in the UK. But I think the space sector in the UK, we do work very closely together. And I think Spaceports, more than any, we do lots of stuff with Saxaboard, which is even further away from you, and Sutherland as well. And I think the Spaceport community, every time I come to a GSA event or go to Spacecom, it does feel like a bit of a psychic connection between communities facing some similar challenges. Good place to launch a rocket, often in a remote location. Remote locations often have shared challenges of providing jobs and opportunities for our young people leaving to go to bigger cities. So Spaceports actually provides you a fixed piece of infrastructure where these large companies and governments, which are always promising that they're going to invest money in our areas, suddenly they have to do it in our areas. You can't launch a rocket from the middle of New York. You can't launch a rocket from the middle of London. We're often from those communities as well. And I think that adds something as well. When you speak to the people who are representing the Scottish Spaceports or the Welsh Spaceports or the Cornwall Spaceports, we're all passionate about our areas and driving investment. And I find that whenever I come over and I speak to the guys from Colorado or Virginia, or, it's always a really welcoming and collaborative community. And I think certainly when we talk about Spaceport Cornwall and launch, it started off first and foremost for us as an economic development opportunity. Back in 2015, 2016, when the UK government started the Launch UK programme, the UK has this thriving space ecosystem. Like Daniel said, Scotland itself produces more satellites than anywhere else, apart from California, I think. But you don't have a launch location. So they're shortlisting sites, and, Cornwall is one of them, Prestwick is one of them, Saxford is one of them, Sutherland is one of them. And we're all areas where, you have to ask, what are we going to get from this? So from Cornwall, we provide uncongested airspace. We're close to the ocean. We have a long runway because we're also a military base. A launch company could come in and conduct a launch and leave quite quickly. So from Cornwall's point of view, it was always, what do we get out of this? And our principal investor is not the national government, it's our local government. So the local Cornwall Council invested £12.5 million in Spaceport Cornwall. And that wasn't to launch satellites into space. That was to provide jobs and opportunities for young people in the area. And I think that's something we have in common with the other sites. So to use a sort of Cornish maritime expression, our approach to launch and spaceports was always, what happens when the tide goes out? What happens when Virgin Orbit, in the first instance, go back to California? What happens when our future launch operators, if they're only coming for a launch campaign, what is left at Spaceport Cornwall that are going to provide these jobs and opportunities for our local people? And that really is the heart of this cluster activity, and using the excitement of launch, using launch as the magnet to attract businesses to come down and physically locate. So we always knew we were going to have to be a new kind of spaceport. So from Cornwall's point of view, that was embracing Cornish values of sustainability and more responsible launch. You've probably seen our mission statement of Space for Good, showcasing all the great things that space does to improve life on Earth, not just all about going out into space, but improving lives back down on Earth. But it was also a new kind of spaceport in the sense that we're not going to be having frequent launches, not regular launches. Like, when we come out to Florida, and I'm just absolutely amazed. It's so routine now. You guys are launching at least once a week. I remember at the most recent Spacecom conference, a load of our guys from DFT went out to watch from the launch and all came back in absolute amazement, having seen this Falcon 9 launch. And US counterparts were just, oh yeah, that happens all the time. So for us, it was always knowing that was not going to be the case. So, Virgin were going to launch a couple of times a year in the first few years of our blueprint. And then we have other launch operators coming on to join them in the next few years. But it was always going to be more often periods when there wasn't going to be launches. So what are we going to do during those times. And we were able to make strategic investments across the site, so sensible investments to try and so with Virgin as the first example, or Sierra Space actually, because we built this building in collaboration with both of them, was how can we keep you on Spaceport Cornwall for longer? So when we first spoke to Virgin, they thought, well, we can do all our integration in Long Beach. We can just ship the rocket over, we can attach it to Cosmic Girl, and we can launch in a couple of weeks. That will give the UK its major important sovereign launch, and the Prime Minister at the time was very excited about that, and we'd have all waved our Union Jacks and been very proud. And actually, what benefit would there have been to the UK economy and the Cornish economy invested so heavily in it? So this first building is our integration facility. So that was really to say to Virgin, come to us to do the integration, get the satellites shipped down to Cornwall. So that takes the launch campaign from a couple of weeks to a couple of months. So, 60 odd engineers spending money in the supply chain, using our MRO companies on site, more economic impact for us. And it also meant that we could invest also in another building, our operations facility, to say to businesses, hey, be part of this exciting narrative that's happening down in Cornwall. So not necessarily companies that were reliant on launch, but enabled by launch. And I've got a slide in a bit about the companies that we've been successful to attract down onto the site. And obviously, of course, at the moment, the situation we're in with Virgin Orbit having gone bust, we're not going to have a launch for a couple of years. So actually, we're very pleased that we went down the cluster development site, because it means that all these businesses are paying our way in this area where we're not going to have a launch. And it's also enabled us to give us some bandwidth to be able to do some other things as well. The other thing was to make sure that the community was with us. So, this is heavily invested by the local community. It's all about our young people. It's inspiring often these young generations of people who perhaps in the not too distant past would have probably had to leave Cornwall, go to the major cities to find opportunity. This is now about going into schools, which our education team do. And that's not just, they've gone into every single school, college, university in Cornwall, but we've also, through the GSA, done international partnerships. So we've got school exchanges with the guys out in Spaceport Alliance, and they have regular webinars, and we hope in the future to actually have physical visits over there, which would just be amazing. And you think about a small place like Cornwall, for these kids to be beamed into their classrooms and have conversations with kids in Japan and on the other side of the world, and actually find some real commonalities between these two. The questions they're asking one another are actually not that far-fetched. And then in relation to that, it's working with our schools and colleges who've always been really ambitious to seize this opportunity. So when we leave these schools and they're all excited about these careers that they're going to have, they are actually then well positioned to get them. So whether that's apprenticeships, whether that's courses at further education colleges, or even our universities where they can study up to master's degrees, Cornwall is now one of the only places in the country where you can study for the full range. And hopefully our young people can have first refusal of these exciting careers that the space companies that have been attracted in because of launch are offering. And a few celebrity fans doesn't hurt as well. I don't know if you can see that, but we have a few people along the way who've been our advocates and kept the profile of Spaceport Cornwall high. And then, so we get to January 2023. So this is, we're doing all this other activity, but of course, the public perception of a spaceport is you have to have a launch. So the first launch was in January 2023, with the business plan obviously firmly fixed on other activity as well. And of course, it was an extremely exciting day, and a number of people on this call were either with us or watching on the live stream. But unfortunately, in this instance, in Virgin Orbit's first international launch attempt, they were not successful in getting the satellites into orbit. The difficult thing for us to be able to communicate as a spaceport, and this will, the only thing that is certain is that this will be a shared experience with other spaceports in the future, is you remind everybody that actually the spaceport actually worked. So the spaceport, as far as the infrastructure we provided, that all worked. The licensing framework that the UK government put in place for the very first time, the spaceflight regulation, the licensing for all the satellites, for the operators, all of that worked. So we are now, the morning after we woke up, and unfortunately we're feeling very sorry for ourselves, we did remind ourselves we're the first licensed spaceport anywhere in the UK, we're the only operational orbital spaceport in Europe. And I think the space community were very supportive of that, and the messages were flooding in from operators and other spaceport compartments of saying, you're not in charge of the hardware. What you did was actually a success. But the business model was perhaps tested earlier than we wanted as far as being able to do other things. So we had the launch attempt in January 23, and then in April 23, we're opening our operations facility, which is the second building of our Centre for Space Technologies campus. So you take a bit of a deep breath at that point. You know, you've put all this stuff on paperwork as far as everyone's going to be attracted by the excitement of launch, but you don't know if they are. And of course, you throw COVID into the mix as well, and suddenly are people actually wanting to come back to use offices and labs and all that sort of stuff? Well, thankfully, if you're doing spaceport or satellite manufacture, you usually do need to come into work. We didn't know for sure that they would. But actually now, just over a year on from opening this building, we're now almost completely full. And just last week, we went through a process with Cornwall Council, who've just approved us to speak to an investment partner who will be investing £100 million plus into the site to develop other areas and other buildings so we can grow on from this space. So I think hopefully, you know, it has worked, you know, as far as this cluster activity that we always wanted to provide. And the bandwidth, you know, an unintended consequence of having a little bit more bandwidth to focus on other people other than just Virgin Orbit does mean now we're trying to broaden the operational capability of the site. So we're working with Royal Naval Airfield down at Predannock, which is in Cornwall, which is operated by Hulbert. And we want to combine the capability of what we have at Cornwall Airport, Newquay, Spaceport Cornwall, still the only operational spaceport in Europe, and Hulbert, to provide a full end-to-end service offering for future air and space. So that's you know, across the three sites there, and that probably wouldn't, we would always wanted to do that, but we probably wouldn't have been able to do it so early if we were focusing purely on Virgin in these first couple of years. So the next launch in Cornwall probably isn't going to be for another 18 months. But as far as the success of the cluster, we have businesses on site now providing these jobs and opportunities. So it's been a real success. We're open for business. And while we look forward to the next launches, we've got plenty of stuff to do in the meantime. So thanks so much.
Excellent. Great comments, Ross. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. David Alexander, who is responsible for providing vision, direction, and leadership, managing the various Rice Space Institute programs, identifying and fostering research opportunities for the faculty, and interacting with government and the space industry. And he's been named a Global Scot by the Scottish government. So, David, how do you respond to some of the things we've talked about today? What are some of the other observations that you have that would relate to the idea of space clusters, both in the local communities and then internationally?
Yeah, well, it's hard to follow all those comments. I would say, though, that some of my friends back in Houston think being a Global Scot is just some kind of frequent flyer program, which I'm trying to feel is, you know, is maybe a little bit irrelevant. I'm currently sitting in Scotland in Dumfries, and it's the European Lunar Symposium. And Daniel touched on this a little bit earlier. It's kind of a testament, like a region like the south of Scotland here, which is very agricultural land and farming centric, is actually looking at space as a potential future industry for them. And I think that's a testament to the work of pretty much everyone except me on this panel, because of what they're doing to galvanise the space industry across the UK. And so I think people are starting this. I'll come back to that in a second. I don't have any slides, and I'll try and be brief so that we can get back to the actual operators. But the distinction between spaceport and clusters can be quite distinct, or they can actually be completely integrated. And there's two different ways of looking at that. In Houston, of course, we have a license. In fact, George, you were, I think, the person who signed that license back in 2015. But we knew that we got a license for horizontal launch. So like Cornwall and like Prestwick, one of the first MOUs we signed was with Prestwick, actually. I'm on the board of directors for the Houston Spaceport Development Corporation, so forgive me, I always refer to the spaceport as we. But Arturo Machuca, who you mentioned earlier, is going to Congress with you, and he was on our last webinar. He really takes a huge amount of credit for the success down there. But even though we have the license for horizontal launch, the vision was always about creating a cluster, and a cluster of space-related activities. And we're here to focus on the UK, so I'm not going to say too much about that. But what's interesting is when you look at the UK, geographically, it's quite high population density. And so you have, obviously, Scotland's got a lot of open land. And Ross talked about, the access to the sea from Cornwall. But what that does is, I think it allows the clusters to actually work. And as Gemma pointed out, the clusters talk to each other. And they don't necessarily have to build a whole facility from scratch that you might do in the middle of Texas somewhere, because Texas is huge if you haven't been there. but it allows that kind of space conversation to permeate the whole community, whether it be the West Country all the way up to Shetland. And I think that's where what you're hearing today and what everyone has said, they're putting all those pieces together. They're essentially, it's the same recipe, but they've got their own spices, right? A little bit of different flavour here, a little bit of different flavour there as to what they can do within that community. So I think that's one of the key aspects, and it's how the UK is developing this combination of, remote, if you want to call it, remote spaceports because of launch and all the safety concerns, but then integrating it into the support infrastructure that goes with that, and that doesn't just include hardware, it includes people and the education side of things that Ross has talked about. So I think the 2 points from the perspective of someone like Houston looking at the UK and looking at the space industry in the UK and the launch industry, I think that international connection is really, really important. NASA will tell you we can't do what we're trying to do without international partners. And that means more than government signing a piece of paper. It means the capabilities being developed in these countries, these national partners that we're trying to bring together for everything from low Earth orbit all the way to the moon and eventually onto Mars. And I think the university community within the UK is particularly strong, actually, given the size of the UK. And that, again, is another key element. So that international connection, I think, is there, whether it be at the academic level, the business level, or the government level, I think is really crucial. And then, of course, it's been touched on, but the educational aspect. I mean, it's the workforce needs to be there for these aspirations that everyone has. You have to have the workforce has to be knowledgeable. And in many cases, it has to be a reskilled workforce. We're not just talking about taking people out of secondary school and then on to colleges and universities and on. We're actually talking about skills across the board, and that means upskilling people, reskilling people, and then bringing those young people who may not be thinking about a college degree. They may be thinking about working in the industry that their parents worked in and so on. And now there's a new opportunity for them to think about space. And we've got lots of good stories from Houston about how that works. But I think that's what's key. And I think those are the two elements that I think have been touched on by everyone. But I just wanted to re-emphasize those aspects. It's at some point it's about bringing in the business. The biggest point is why we're doing it. And that's to sort of take on the challenge, get to space, do the things that we need to do in space, but also use what we have in space to benefit what we do here. And that allows communities like an agricultural community like the south of Scotland to actually be a participant, not just an audience member, an onlooker, but actually be a participant in the space development. So I think these are the kind of things where the cluster aspect really comes to play. And again, Gemma mentioned different industries. That's a really important, slightly separate topic in terms of what I'm saying. But bringing in that skill and that information from other clusters and working out how they've solved the problems really factors in, and it kind of leads the way to I think what will be a successful space industry within the United Kingdom.
Thank you, David. So let me circle back and ask a few questions here. Gemma, first of all, for you, I mean, this whole program is about clusters. I'm not sure I had been that familiar with that term until recently. Could you just say a little bit more about what do you mean by the term cluster? What's your vision for what you're trying to accomplish after giving all those great examples? How do you like to view that terminology, and what does it mean for the rest?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. So I think it's used to mean lots of different things. I mean, from a Harwell perspective, it's around we have a campus, so we're bringing together organizations in one sector together to help grow. So that's from industry, academia, and government. But I think it's actually about, it can be lots of the other clusters work on a geographic area, locality. So our sort of STFC sister site in the northwest of England. So they have a science and technology campus there, but it's a bit smaller, but their space cluster works across geographically. So I think the key bit is having, for a cluster to work, you need some anchor institutions, in my opinion. So we're fortunate with kind of RAL Space and STFC, and then some key stakeholders like ESA. But it is about also having that facilitated access. So these cluster managers, these state, that can kind of pull everything together also is really vital. And actually, I think that's what makes it work. So I guess it's about having a place where you can take get a job in the sector, in the area that you want to, and have an opportunity to move to different or grow your kind of career as well, but be in a similar place. So if in Scotland, if you want to stay in Scotland, there's so much opportunity there because of the clusters around the area. Even on the campus, it's a smaller scale, but there's opportunities there. But of course, the piece around ensuring the future workforce is really important, and I think everyone's behind that, trying to think about how we can ensure that going forward.
Excellent. And Francis, let me come back to you and ask again, with the artistic innovations and different perspectives that you talked about, can you connect that more with what does that mean in terms of either facilities or design, or how can that impact what a spaceport is in order to make sure that we can have some of these connections and these partnerships that you talked about?
I think that's a really key question, and I would qualify the creative and the technical by saying I don't think the creative and the technical things are independent of each other or mutually exclusive. I think they have to work together. What I think is where I think the creativity comes from a couple of things. It comes from seeing the opportunities in space to suggest different ways of doing things than they have been done to now. It suggests a number of things which are maybe solutions to problems that we have that are very immediate problems, like we have a housing crisis, we have the jobs and careers crisis, we have a lot of things in the UK that I think could be we could be on the way to solving them, using space and spaceports as kind of a focal point, especially in the area that I was looking at with the presentation around the Irish Sea and around those communities in the north of England and Scotland and Ireland that have they've got a proud history, but they've got a difficult last few decades in terms of when I live there, what do I do? And Ross touched on this with Cornwall as well, that these places that are not in the big major urban centres, how do you keep young people there? How do you give them a sense of meaning and a sense of a path? And so the creativity comes from understanding our limits, right? So what I think our job, and you and I have talked about this, about the idea about creating a platform. We don't quite know where it's going to go, but we have faith in the younger generation to pick up what we give them and do something quite, amazing with it. So that's what I think is the creative aspect of it, is doing what we can to let the younger generation, my kids, come along and sort of blow our minds with what they come up with.
Excellent, thank you, that helps. Okay, and Daniel, you had lots of examples of how you're engaging with communities and different organizations and so forth. Can I ask you to just step back a minute and think whether there might be any lessons learned for how other places can do that same type of connecting and building relationships and networks?
Yeah, I think, it comes back to really getting the benefits out there and thinking about your key messages for any projects. In the space sector, we're not always great, particularly in the UK. You're probably a lot better in the US, but of getting out of that bubble and actually sharing the benefits, the opportunities, whether it's a cluster or anything else, how can you get involved in this? How can you be part of this? And it's such an inspirational industry. Many people grow up thinking about, I'd love to be involved in space and that kind of thing, but they're not sure how. When actually there's places like the UK, and we're seeing many more around the world, where actually there's lots of opportunities, but there's people aren't aware of them necessarily, and they still think of space as being exclusive to government or, moon missions and what have you. Which is why I think for me, and particularly on the AstroAgency side, we try and bring it back to Earth as much as possible, just to get that word out there, to get people to think about what would life be like without access to satellites, and what role can they play in that value chain itself. I think one of the examples I have in terms of working with outside of the sector and drawing in experience and sharing was when we were working on the space sustainability roadmap. The first thing we did is we reached out to Friends of the Earth, which is an environmental charity in the UK, because we thought, well, they're likely to be one of the biggest critics and one of the organizations that are going to be looking at things like launch and quite concerned about it. So we felt that it was important to speak to them early and just engage, because, you know, you can put your head in the sand, but that will only get you so far. So we realized it would be really important to actually speak to potentially our biggest critics and see what we could learn from. And that was a fantastic experience, and we actually got a lot of good advice. I think someone mentioned earlier about the importance of learning from other clusters and other sectors. And interestingly, friends of theirs suggested we learn from the whisky sector, which in Scotland is quite a prominent sector. But it's another industry that kind of changed it's the way it worked, and they created their kind of roadmap, their strategy on trying to be more environmentally conscious. They changed their packaging, and, you know, they were always seen as, you know, polluting rivers and things like that. But it's really changed now. And they were given as a great example. So I had the terrible, difficult job of having to engage with the space, between space and whiskey. But we learned a lot from them, you know, we really did. And it gave us that idea to go ahead and create that roadmap that we've been able to share internationally with a number of different space agencies. So not exactly clusteral development, but as we've said, all of the clusters really in the UK are looking at being more sustainable. So there is that angle.
Excellent, thank you. And along those lines, Ross, again, Cornwall has done such a great job of building that support in the local community. You mentioned the student engagements and other things like that. Is that just up to the local leaders of a spaceport? What's your suggestions for how other people can make sure that they have strong support and relationships with the community itself?
Yeah, well, I think it's like a lot of, you know, we talk about sustainability and the environmental impact of things as well, which now is increasingly having, you know, it's now becoming commercially viable. So, you know, we've talked about it for years, but now either our customers are demanding it, so it's in things that we do, and in a way, the community side is the same. So for us, you know, we really are a community project, so we have to be transparent. So, you know, we're majorly or primarily funded by the local council, so we have councillors as our stakeholders to update about whether how we're spending their investment, but it's also about showcasing to the community why we're building this spaceport and why we're going into space, not just how we go to space and sort of like, you know, getting excited about the technology, but showing them how, you know, in our traditional industries in Cornwall, so tourism and fishing and agriculture, how all of those industries are being completely enabled by space. And I think maybe a few years ago, certainly in the UK, we weren't probably good enough at that. The space sector wasn't good enough at that. You know, we've got countless examples of how space is contributing to everybody's lives and improving lives all over the world. And I think Gemma's work at Harwell, and, you know, she had the slide with the clusters around the UK. I mean, I forgot to mention that, but we're absolutely blessed to have Cornwall Space Cluster representing all of the space companies in Cornwall. And I know all the other cluster managers across the UK are equally passionate about their areas. So that's not just advocating for what we do, but it's collaborating across other clusters in the UK. And that has really helped us. And that provides political will as well, because when our MPs come down, whether it's our local MPs or ministers from central government, we had the actual, so we've got 2 new deputy CEOs for the UK Space Agency who are doing a job share. And they're going around all the clusters at the moment, getting to know the capability around the country. So they came to see us, and we had the usual sort of boardroom, very formal meeting, introduced them to into the local businesses that are around. And then we took them into our clean room, where we have UK Space Agency's like one-to-one model Launcher 1 rocket. And we had a whole class of year 3s. So for trying to translate that to Americans, they're all like 6 or 7 years old. So they go into this clean room, and you've got 30 kids running around like maniacs, and, you know, asking these CEOs like, "What's the best thing about your job? Why did you get into space?" You know, and you know, in a cynical way, of course, you know, you send them back on the train back up to London, absolutely passionate about what's happening in Cornwall. And of course, then they go all on their socials, and they're talking about what an amazing experience. And you know that actually what's remained with them is seeing the reaction from those kids. It's not meeting the space sector professionals, but it's seeing how excited the community is about space. And I think things like spaceports are uniquely positioned to do that, because it doesn't require much explanation. You just walk into a spaceport, or you walk into a satellite ground station like Goonhilly that we've got, and it's immediately inspiring. It doesn't require a lot of explanation. So yeah, we've been really really passionate about working with our local community, because like without them, we certainly wouldn't have got to where we are now, and hopefully they'll all be working with us in the years to come.
Excellent, thank you. So David, let me give you the opportunity for some final words. We've heard some great discussions from different aspects just in the UK. Any trends you can draw or any extrapolations to international connections? How can we make a bigger cluster of all these smaller clusters?
Yeah, well, you can tell Arturo to stop texting me. Arturo Machuca is the director of the Houston Spaceport. We actually, on that front, we wrote an article many years ago, Arturo and I, about exactly that notion. Is that the phrase, and you heard me say this many times when we first started the Spaceport Summit, even before the GSA was created, which was that there was no such thing as a spaceport industry. And we could all compete for $0 or £0 or €0, and we'd all get a fair share. But we could work together to create that network and create that industry, and then compete based on our strengths, because now there was something to compete for. And I think that still is there. There's the opportunity to collaborate and grow the industry as a whole, and take advantage of all the things that everyone said in terms of why we do it, and the benefit to knowledge about the Earth and all these other things. And so I think that's the key element is you work locally, work with your strengths. Ross mentioned that you bring in your community. I think what's really maybe worth saying, I think, is that when we do these webinars and we do whatever we do ourselves, there is a tendency that we're preaching to the converted. We're talking within a bubble. People who are on here are interested in space. They're interested in what the panel has to say. The panel, of course, are interested in space. And even in Houston, you talk to the average person in the street, they don't necessarily know that there's a spaceport there, even though it's one of the most successful commercial spaceports in the world, thanks to, I'll say it out loud, thanks to Arturo. But the thing is that the general public don't really know it unless you tell them. And this is something that I think everybody on the panel, have actually said, is that the benefit is there, the excitement is there, but people have to know about it because they're too busy doing their own jobs and their own daily life. And I think that's where we can all come together. And space is truly exciting to everybody. You know that more than anybody. And so we do need to sort of broaden the conversation to who we bring in, and then not just bring them into, aren't we cool because we're doing space stuff, but how can you participate in this? And it doesn't have to be you don't have to be a rocket engineer. You just have to want to be excited about space. And so I think what you're seeing across the UK and with the people on this panel, I think are kind of exemplifying that. They're not just talking about, we launch rockets or we do this. They're actually talking about all those different parts and how together we kind of grow what happens either in the UK, in Texas, in the United States, and around the world. And I think that's really an important message to get across.
Fantastic. What a great takeaway and a great way to wrap our very interesting discussion today. Thank all of the panelists and thank all the participants for tuning in today. And we will be posting a recording of this session on the Global Spaceport Alliance website if you would like to share that with others or re-listen to some of the particularly inspiring examples. So with that, let me turn it back over to James for our final conclusion.
Thank you, George, and thank you, Francis and Gemma, Ross, Daniel, David. It's all about, communication, networking, and understanding the benefits of talking with one another. And I think that's what GSA really, really does. I can't really add much to what was already discussed. So what I'd like to suggest is that you all book now for January 27 in Orlando, Florida for the Spaceport Summit. And remember that kicks off a commercial space week, which includes space mobility and includes space calm. And thank you all very much for your participation.